Okay, Miss Kyle, notes in any way. So we're going to go through my notes on this in a video because I like talking and I think it's the best way to get my points across. I'll try to be as brief as I can. So, for some context on the medieval period. The medieval period roughly began in the early thousands, and it was a result of actions performed in the late 800s as a result of Alfred the Great defeating the Danes and then putting them in northern England. And then they didn't like it up there. So they were like, hey, I want to go conquer northern France. And they're like, okay, cool. And then they went and they conquered northern France. Well, later on in the mid thousands, you had the death of Edward the Confessor. And though Harold II was going to be the king, according to the Council of Elders, Duke William of Normandy was like, no, I want to be king. And I mean, he had some reason apparently to want to be king or to deserve to be king, but that's besides the point. At the Battle of Hastings, this battle between the Duke William and Harold II ended. Duke William won, but as a result of these battles, a lot of the native English nobility died. So one thing that you could connect here to literature is you have the death of a large educated, literate population who speaks English. So as a result, all the educated people are now French. And then William didn't like the English nobility, so then he came in there, and the rest of them, he was like, get out, or die, or whatever. He didn't like them. So now everyone's freaking French. That's the worst ending. But the common people were English. This is called the Nomad Conquest, by the way, and ushered in the period of medieval history in Europe. So, as I mentioned earlier, English became the language of the lower class and almost spoken exclusively by poor people. And that sucks. Ballads are mentioned a little bit later, but that's really the only source of English literature we have for this region, even though it's not really literature, it was songs about like love or betrayal. But this era is called Anglo-Nomad literature. One downside of it is that it was very straightforward. So as opposed to like, I don't know, Stevens in Remains of the Day, who's very, very long-winded and intricate with his descriptions. This is very straight and to the point. So that's not real literature. I want a landscape described to me. One important innovation in literature during this region, though, that ended up coming back in the modern day is the idea of rhymed stanzas. Before it was alliterate verses, whatever the crap that means, but it sounds lame. Rhymed stanzas are super cool. My hero, Eminem, uses them. So, mic drop. And by the end of the century, much of the population was speaking English again. Yay, finally. Basically, the French got bored and they were like, hey, give me northern France back. And the nomads were all in England and they didn't like that the French were doing that. And the French had a lot of influence on England, but because they kind of like invaded, they weren't super happy. So then everyone became English again, which I don't know why they didn't do that in the first place. It seems obvious. One thing in terms of the organization of medieval society, William the Conqueror brought feudalism to England. Feudalism is the idea that the king owns everything, and then he has barons, and then there's lower nobility. You have your lower lords and stuff like that, and your lower nobility rents out their land. Not really rents out, they own the land, and then they own the people too. So that's great. And then the peasants or serfs, who are the owned people, work on the land, enforced by the army, which was also lower nobility. And by army, I mean like knights and guards and stuff like that. An important note is the idea of vassalage. So just as you would have a kind of an expanding tree downward, you would have a chain of responsibilities upward. So, for instance, a peasant was responsible to the lower nobility, who was responsible to the barons, who was responsible to the king, and that's a perfect transition into that the king was responsible to the Pope. And now we can talk about the church. So the church was headed by the Pope. We're talking, of course, about the Roman Catholic Church. You would have semi-literate parish and priests. You'd also have learned cardinals, archbishops, and bishops in the church clergy. One common quarrel in this era was quarrels between clergymen and political figures, and that is kind of what Cadbury Tale is about. Not about, but the context for it to exist is about the murder of the Archbishop of Cadbury by barons loyal to Henry II. Literature during this time from the church was kind of like lame. I had a Lego picture Bible when I was a kid, and it was awesome. But literature in this era concerned itself mostly with reminders of death and contempt for the world. I think if you gave me a book in my childhood that had those as the themes, I don't think I'd be the same dude. I think I'd be reading Edgar Allan Poe right now. Another important development from the church was crusades. So crusades, kind of a bad thing, but a good thing came from it. A good thing that came from it is the Crusade of Persia, which resulted in love poetry, and with it, many portraits of idealized women. And with those portraits of idealized women, people were like, hey, ideal woman? Mary made Jesus together. So then you had the ideal perfect woman now being Mary. Geoffrey Chaucer, he is the author of the Cadbury Tales. He was a court poet, and the entire book that he wrote is about them having a pilgrimage, which is like a trek to a holy site, a group of people, a pilgrimage to Cadbury, England, the site of the killing of St. Thomas Chancer. And instead of having TikTok or Snapchat, they didn't have anything. So they had to make up stories. And this whole book is just about them telling moral tales, folk tales, and random stuff they make up along the way toward Cadbury. Romance was also innovated in this time, and it was based on the idea of chivalry, which, if that looks like horse to my French people out there, that's because it is based on a horse, because knights wore. I did that again. Knights used horses. So, since romance itself was based on the standards of knightly conduct, that makes sense. These stories would usually involve some big hero knight having trials. These trials might be a quest to go test a virtue, defeat a dragon, something of that regard. But the entire purpose of their little trial was to impress this fair lady who I guess they wanted to marry. The ideas of romance formed the core of courtly love, which was a code of behaviors between women and their suitors, which was introduced by Eleanor. I'm not going to try to say her wherever she comes from, but it was Henry II's wife, pretty much. The most famous of these is King Arthur. Don't know if you've ever read King Arthur. I've heard of it. I've never read it before. I'll briefly again mention the ballads. These were tales told by the common people. They were oral traditions. They weren't really recorded. They talked about love, betrayal. One interesting thing is Robin Hood comes from this. So thank you, Disney. Medieval dramas. Dramas were usually skits, usually simple skits that were performed in the church. And I'm going to take out some of my AP World History and talk about this for a second. Most of your English people, as I talked about earlier, spoke English until we get to later in this thing. There's a name of some dude who, John Wycliffe, until he translated the Bible into English, you would have to have priests who spoke Latin, who could read the Bible and then translate it to the common people. Before then, there was no Bible to read. They had to go watch these skits. So skits were the only way to effectively communicate the stories of the Bible to the common people. These were usually about saints and biblical stories, as I just mentioned. There are three main categories. There are mystery plays, miracle plays, and mortality plays. These talk about the Bible, saints, and then virtues that I guess the Bible should represent. Political developments, there were a decent amount. So Henry II, he established the feudal system, but he also invented common law, which forms the basis of much of the U.S. and U.K.'s current legal system. It involved traveling judges, but that's besides the point. The Magna Carta was also signed in this era, and it was a charter between the barons and the king because John, the son of Henry II, mucked up being king so bad that they needed to sign like a declaration to say, "Hey, dude, stop! You suck at this. We're going to have some control." And then the parliament was created as a result. In the 100 Years' War, which happened after, um, the English won a decisive victory over French lands as a result of them making the bow bigger. And then they shot the horses, and the knights were like, crap, I can't run in this thing. So they just kind of died. And as a result, a lot of French noblemen were killed. Joan of Arc came in to save the day. She kind of was like, stop it, English. And then she pushed them back to their original borders, and all was good. The period also saw the Peasant Revolt, which was the first demands for individual liberty and human rights, which ended in a brutal suppression, and nothing got done. Sucks. Social and cultural changes. So some universities were founded, Oxford and Cambridge. That's kind of cool. You had merchants and artisans and your middle class starting to get into guilds and apprenticeship programs, and that's pretty cool. With these universities and these guilds and all that, people were like, "Hey, let me go to the city. Stuff's happened in the city," and then the Black Death happened, and they all like died and crap, and then they all left the city. But that's besides the point. John Wycliffe, I mentioned him earlier. He translated the Bible into English. Thank you, dude. So people could now interpret text on their own instead of needing the priest to tell them whatever the Bible said, and formed the foundation for the Protestant Reformation this time. William Caxton introduced movable type. I thought the Gutenberg press was the printing press. I'm not going to call it the printing press, but it was like kind of the printing press. It printed the Cadbury Tales. I don't know. Someone invented the printing press and everyone was happy. And in the end of the medieval period, basically England was torn between two factions, Crip, also known as House of Lancaster, and Blood, also known as the House of York. And it ended with King Henry, the V117th, becoming king. So thank you for my 12-minute rant. I think this was longer than a page of notes. Maybe. I hope it was informative. I even threw in some of my own AP World History stuff. So hopefully I didn't waste too much of your time. If you're watching this in SRT, I'm happy I took like half your SRT. Not happy, sorry. But thank you. Subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, and Discord.